Hey everyone! In this lesson, we're going to be digging a little deeper into some of the basics of Python. So we're going to talk about a couple of important things that are going to help you to become a better programmer, like adding comments to your code, and then also being able to get input and output from a user. That's going to enable you to build interactive programs, which is one of the first steps towards being able to build your own full-fledged programs in Python. Let's get started. Adding documentation to your code is one of the most important things you can do as a programmer to support yourself and your fellow programmers. So here are the top 7 reasons that you should add comments to every program that you write. First reason is to identify the name of the creator and the date of creation. Right? This is how you take ownership over program code that you yourself have written. This is how you protect your personal property. Second reason, to explain the purpose or function of the program. Anyone who picks up your code is going to want to know what the program does, and you can use comments to explain this purpose in plain language. This allows your code to be reusable. Number 3, explain each code segment or block of code. This is where you get into a little more detail, and this is sort of an interesting one where it can help other people understand your code, but it can also help you as you're trying to debug and figure out where problems in your program are. Having those comments there to explain each code segment can help you find problems quickly and fix them. Number 4, to keep track of changes made in the program. As you develop as a computer programmer, you are going to be writing programs that you improve on over time. Comments are a great way to keep track of the changes that you've made in the program so that you can remember code that you had in the past, and you can also keep track of the development as it progresses. Number 5, give credit to work that might have been done by someone else. Right? If you're going to take code from someone else, lots of programmers put their programming code out there to, aid other programmers, to allow people to reuse their code to build on the work that has already been done. This is great, but you do need to give credit to that work and to whoever created it. Number 6, temporarily remove lines of code from execution to help with debugging. This is a big one and one that I think often gets overlooked. You can use comments, and you're going to see how this works in a little bit, to comment. We call this commenting out. Basically to make a line of code stop executing, to narrow in and figure out this is especially useful if you're trying to find which lines of code are causing a problem. You can comment out the ones you don't want to run if you know that they're not causing the problem, and this helps you narrow in on the one that is causing the problem. Number 7 is provide additional information that is not included or is not easily understandable from looking directly at the code. Right? This might be things like providing additional context for how that program is going to be used, where you got, maybe if you're using different libraries for this program, even additional information about what the plans for future development might be. All of this additional information you can add in using comments. So I hope that at this point I've convinced you should be adding comments to your code. Now let's see how you actually do that in Python. So in Python, you're going to use the pound symbol, or some of you probably call it the hashtag symbol, for single line comments. This is where you have one line of non-code text that you want to put in, and you can basically put the hashtag at the beginning of the line and then write your comment on the rest of the line. So you can use this at the beginning of your program if you want to add, header, maybe when it was created, a little bit of information, and then you can also use it after a line of code to comment about that particular line. So you can use this comment to say, oh, this line prints out, how are you? If you want to have multiple comments, say like a big block of comments, you can use in Python triple quotes for multi-line comments. So the way you would do that is you use triple quotation marks at the beginning and at the end, and then anything you write between those two is going to be considered a comment. This is sort of a more common structure you might see right here, where you have the triple quotes on their own line, you have a big block of comments, and then you have a triple quotes after that. You can also use single quotation marks if you want to use those instead. In Python, single quotes and double quotation marks are fairly interchangeable, as we'll see today. All right, so those are the ways you can add comments into your code. Now, you're also probably wondering, how do I output things to the screen? We saw this a little bit in the previous lesson where you learned how to print, but you may want to start to print out more complex sentences or more complex words to the screen. And so in Python, you can also use triple quotation marks triple single quotes or double quotes to indicate that you have multiple lines that you wanted to print out. So here you would see, okay, we have the print command, we have opening parentheses, and then you use 3 quotation marks, and then you can say hello world on 2 different lines, and then end it with triple quotes. Same idea here, except you're using single quotes. This also would print out each of these things on their own line. What about reading input, right? You're going to want to be able to read input from your user if you want to make interactive programs. So in Python, there's a really nice method you can use to do this called input. A method, or a function as I sometimes call them, is the same thing as a block in Scratch. And so in the same way that you can use a block to add some function to your program, you can use a method in Python to do the same thing. So you'll notice that this method is called input, and then we put parentheses after it to indicate that we're calling a method here. It's the same thing basically as the ask block in Scratch. So the most simple way you would do this is you just write input and then parentheses, and this will allow the user to type in a response. So there will be a prompt for the person to type in, or a blinking cursor, and they get to type in information. In this next example here, this is how you would actually assign the value that the person inputs into a variable called name, right? So you have input parentheses, that's calling the method, but then you're using this equal sign, the assignment operator, to save whatever value is input by the person typing into this variable name, and then you could print out their name. You're going to have a chance to try this in your coding activity. This third example is probably the most common, where you would actually want to have a prompt on the screen that basically instructs the user how they should and what they should type into your program. So you would say name equals input parentheses quotation marks enter your name, and then this colon is just basically going to have a colon on the screen. This is not syntax because it's between these quotation marks, it's just part of the string, and this is going to be now on the screen, and it's going to tell the person, okay, enter your name. Then they will have a space here where they can type their name, and then when they hit enter, that's going to be saved into this variable name. So those are the ways that you would use the input method in Python. Now, we talked a little bit last class about this idea of AP pseudocode, and I wanted to now start to show you some examples of AP pseudocode so that you can sort of like connect the pseudocode that you see to the Python that you're learning, because pseudocode is a text-based language as well. So in pseudocode, you can also output and input information to the screen and from the program. The way to output things to the screen is by using all caps the word display, and then in parentheses you would type the expression that you wanted to display. So whatever it is, if it's a string or if it's a couple of variables, you put that in parentheses here. Getting input in pseudocode uses a method that is all capital letters input. So you'll notice that in AP pseudocode, this is a convention that all of the methods or the functions that you call are going to be all capital letters. So this is the same name as the one in Python, right? But it's all capital letters, which lets you know that this is pseudocode. So the way that I assigned that input into the variable name is using an arrow. AP pseudocode does not use the equal sign to assign values. It actually uses an arrow. So that's what I wanted to talk about on this slide, is assigning variables or assigning values to variables. In Scratch, remember, we use the set block. In Python, we use this equal sign, and in AP pseudocode, we use the arrow. In all 3 of these examples, we are doing the exact same thing. We're creating a variable called score, and we're putting the number 100 saved into that variable score. The thing about Python is that it has these things called data types, and you need to be more aware of this because in a text-based language, information that's stored into a variable can act differently depending on what type of data type is stored there. You don't really see this in Scratch as much because Scratch tends to sort of hide this from you to make it a little easier to write your programs. But now that you're using a more advanced programming language, you should be aware that variables have data type. And what that means is that the program needs to know, or it remembers, what type of information is in there. So there are 4 types that you should be aware of. The first is a string, and string is like any type of characters that are not numeric. So typically you'll think of that as like sentences, words, like the word hello between quotation marks. That's going to be a string. The second example here, variable equals true. True and false are special values. They're a special data type called booleans. Okay, and those are what are going to be used to control things like if statements, those conditions. Next up, we have the number 8. This is an integer. 8 is an integer because it doesn't have a decimal place. And when you store numbers that don't have a decimal place, in Python, they're going to be stored as an integer, which is basically one way that Python stores numbers. And the reason this is different from the next one we'll see, which is float, is that integers are not going to require as much memory as a number that has a decimal point. So the last example, float, is the data type for storing numbers that have a decimal place. All right, so those are the 4 data types that you need to be aware of. There are other data types, but these are sort of the basic ones that you're going to work with in Python. One other thing to notice in this code is that we're calling the print method, but then inside of here, instead of printing out the variable itself, we're calling another method, which is type. And type will actually take a variable, and then what it does is it produces this definition or this word that represents the type of that variable. So that's how we're getting this printout that says class str, class bool, class int, class float. That's because string, boolean, integer, and float is the type of each of these variables once they've been assigned the values on the right. So you can figure out the data type, and in Python, it's going to be like dynamically assigned. Basically, it's going to be assigned, data type is going to be assigned to your variable as soon as you store some information in there. And that is one way that Python is more flexible than some other programming languages. Because variable by itself doesn't have a data type. It's only once you store information in there that it gets this data type assigned to it. And you can notice here, you can change the data type of the variable just by assigning new information to it. However, there might be times when you actually want to change the data type of a variable. If you want to do this in your code, you can do that by doing something called typecasting. Typecasting basically temporarily changes the data type using a function. So you have a few functions that correspond to these 4 different data types to typecast a variable to a specific data type, and it will basically convert it into that data type for a short amount of time. So here you'll see we create a variable called number, set it equal to 100. But then inside of this print statement, we're calling the typecast function for a float on number. And what that does is inside of this print statement, number is now going to be converted into a float. And so when we print it out, we actually get 100.0. But if we print out the original variable, number, then it's still 100. Right? That is basically showing you that it was only converted to a float inside of this method. And so that was temporary. The change did not alter the number itself. Another way you could do that, or actually assign the value into the variable, or to alter the actual variable itself, would be to assign it and say number equals float number. And then you print that number out and you see that the variable itself has actually been changed now. Okay, so typecasting is a little more advanced, but you are going to see this in coding exercise 2, because sometimes you will find it useful to change between especially floats and integers. All right, one last concept for today's lesson, which is concatenation. Concatenation is when you join 2 or more strings together. All right, now I know up to this point in Scratch, you've been calling it join. And that's a perfectly good word for combining strings together. But when you start to work with other programming languages and you start to read documentation or other types of programs, you're going to see people using this word. And so we wanted to introduce it. The word concatenation basically means joining 2 or more strings together. So the way that you do that in Scratch is you use the join block, right? And that combines all of these parts together. In Python, we actually use the plus sign for this. And this is an important lesson because the plus sign has now multiple meanings depending on what data types you're working with. If you use the plus sign between 2 integers, it's going to add them together like addition. But if you use the plus sign between 2 strings, it's going to combine them into a longer message. And that's why concatenation is an important example to understand. That is the end of lesson 2 in unit 4. At this point, you're going to try some of these concepts yourself in coding exercises A and B. You're going to practice using input and output in some new Python programs that you're going to write yourself. Good luck.